What I'd like to do now is to talk about an asset that appears in the financial statements of many firms in the extractive industries, and that is exploration and evaluation expenditures carried forward. In terms of thinking about what the regulation says for these expenditures carried forward, which are assets, we need to think about whether those assets are going to be accounted for on an historic cost basis or a current value basis. In making this decision, or coming to a view on this, we've historically looked at what is the asset and the business model, the duration for which the assets are held, and whether it's likely there will be material changes in the value of those assets. In relation to extractive industries and expenditures incurred on exploration and evaluation, it's probably fair to say that this would suggest a current value approach, because many of these firms go out there trying to find resources, and that's what their business model is. It often occurs over very large periods of time, and we'd have to say that there's typically a very small or very low, weak relationship between the expenditures incurred and what's found. So there's going to be material changes in value. And that would probably suggest a fair value approach, because historic cost numbers are potentially quite irrelevant. However, we could equally say that it's problematic how you determine what those fair values are. Now, what is the value of resources that you're looking for? And so it's probably fair to say that neither historic cost or current value are probably going to work very well. And our choice at the end of the day is going to be the best of what's probably a bad lot. Because of the problems of calculating fair value are probably insurmountable, we probably have to say it's going to be an historic cost approach to accounting for these expenditures. If it's an historic cost approach, I would suggest that we think about how we accounted for PPE, property, plant, equipment, and just see how the standard follows that same basic process. What we're going to be talking about is understanding what's addressed by the standard, and then seeing how it addresses what are the common characteristics of an historic cost standard. What costs to carry forward, limits on the costs that can be carried forward, and recognition of those costs. First, we need to identify what the standard applies to. And IAS 6, AASB 6, provides us in Appendix A with some definitions. And perhaps the most important definition is that it tells us that exploration and evaluation expenditures are expenditures incurred on the evaluation for and the evaluation of mineral resources. So digging holes in the ground, looking for stuff, and evaluating whether it's worthwhile getting it up. That's pretty straightforward. So once we understand what it applies to generally, we can start to then think about how it addresses the typical historic cost standard issues. The first issue is how it identifies what costs can be carried forward. And it does this in a very traditional way. It tells us that we recognise exploration and evaluation costs carried forward at cost, historic cost, and identifies what are the elements of that cost. It describes it quite generally as the costs associated with finding specific resources, and it then goes on and provides some quite detailed examples of what these costs might include. This is not dissimilar from what we've seen previously in other standards for assets which adopt an historic cost approach, in that it describes a class of costs, and there are many common aspects to these classes of costs. One of the things which is unique or distinctive about this standard is that it then goes on and tells us how we're going to aggregate those costs. For many physical assets which are manufactured or purchased, it's quite clear what we're purchasing, and so the extent of the asset is quite clear. When it comes to exploration and evaluation, it's not exactly clear what we're finding, because what we've got as an asset, because the asset is actually pre-existing. It's not what we make or what we purchase, it's pre-existing. And so the standard goes on and says that when we're thinking about these exploration and evaluation costs, we will aggregate them on the basis of the area of interest within which those exploration and evaluation costs are incurred. So what it's telling us is that what is the bounds of the assets that we're looking at. It also goes on and tells us that we can carry forward these costs as long as exploration and evaluation is ongoing. That's in Australian paragraph 7.2. And it's a little bit unusual because it doesn't make the carrying forward of costs in any way conditional upon there being future benefits. That's what's made this standard controversial. Has made the accounting for these expenditures more generally controversial. And we'll talk about this more in a few moments when we talk about impairment. The second issue which has to be addressed whenever we have an historic cost standard is how does it place limits on the costs that can be carried forward. No surprising here, we get inside IAS 6 to AASB 6 and it says apply the requirements of impairment of assets, AASB 136, IAS 36. That should seem pretty stock standard and not surprising, but it then goes on and makes a difference, and it says that we're going to employ different triggers. Whereas in IAS 6 whereas in IAS 36 AASB 136, it talked about looking for indicators of impairment. What we're told in this standard here is that we won't effectively have to do an impairment test until there is a cessation of exploration and evaluation activities. Please note this is actually quite consistent with what we saw previously in Oz paragraph 7.2. You carry forward the costs as long as exploration and evaluation was ongoing, and there's no impairment test until you stop doing that. So there's a consistency between paragraph 20 and 7.2, and it really allows us to carry forward expenditure even if we can't establish that there are future benefits. That's one of the major problems with accounting for extractive industries and these types of expenditures in particular. Apart from that, impairment of assets works in the same way. Once it occurs, you work out the recoverable amount. If the recoverable amount is less than book value of assets, you have to recognise an asset impairment, and it's quite consistent. The third aspect of any standard concerned with accounting for assets on an historic cost basis is how do you recognise the costs. This is addressed in IAS 6 to AASB 136. And what it says is that when you finish your exploration and evaluation, you need to evaluate whether there are future benefits. If not, you impair it. And if there are future benefits, then you need to reclassify it. And this reclassification may see the recognition of tangible and intangible assets. These will be accounted for as intangible assets or tangible assets in accordance with IAS 16 to AASB 116 for tangible assets, IAS 138 for intangible assets. Impairments will be a basis for recognising these costs as well. So what we're seeing here is very much the same type of approach that we've seen previously for tangible assets, property, plant and equipment, and intangible assets, IAS 38. Now the standard does talk about some limitations, or recognise there are limitations, and it does concede that historic costs may lose relevance. And in paragraph 12 it says that you can account for these assets on a basis which is consistent with IAS 36 and IAS 16 for intangible or tangible assets respectively. What this means in practice I think is quite blurred, and whether exploration and evaluation expenditures represent tangible assets or intangible assets is a little bit problematic. And the standard does talk about how the process of exploration and evaluation can turn tangible assets into intangible assets. I think that, this is probably more of a personal opinion, that the expenditures carried forward are more likely intangibles, and because there can't be an active market, it does make the ability to choose the revaluation model somewhat redundant. There are significant disclosure requirements, although they're described quite generically in paragraph 23, and I would encourage you to read those. So what we see here is a very short standard. There's been an interim standard. It's been an interim standard now for 15 years. And eventually it's going to come onto the work program for the ISB, and we'll end up with a much more comprehensive standard. I think it is interesting nonetheless, because whilst it is just an interim standard, it does still display all the characteristics that we would expect of a more complete historic cost standard for assets.